Chapter 15 Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes, with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will take us long to crush the human vermin and traitors, and that the great Ford and the great cat lies dead." At this moment the children were for a few seconds in very great danger, for with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of the vile rubble kept sweeping off the hilltop and down the edge right past their hiding place. They let the spectres go by them with the cold wind and felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead they went a flurry of foul wings and the blackness of vultures and giant bats. At the other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent, Susan and Lucy crept out into the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and the thin clouds were passing across, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for their loneliness and cried again, and then again were silent. At last Lucy said, I just can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder if we could take it off." So they tried. After a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without that muscle, it was burst out crying and kissed it and fondled and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all the more lonely and hopeless and horrid that they didn't know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one reading this book is quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. If you had been up all night and cried till you had no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes a time in the end of sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing were ever going to happen again. At any rate, that's how it felt for these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in the dead calm, and they hardly noticed they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. First she took no interest in it, but what did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whoever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they were moving around on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little gray things. "Ugh," said Susan with the other side of the table. "How beastly. These are horrid little crawling things all over him. Go away, you beasts." She raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy. "You've been looking at this as closely as you could. Can't you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe, but how queer! They're nibbling away at the cords." That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. It was quite definitely lighter now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of the little field mice, and at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big low one down by the eastern horizon. They felt colder than it had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes, and Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler, and the light grew, and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours it kind of startled them. Then another bird answered. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk around a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro many times, and they could count between the dead, Aslan and the eastern edge, trying to keep warm, and oh, how they're tired their legs got. Then at last they stood for a moment, looking out toward the sea at Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out. The red turned to a gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, great crackling, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken the giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I, I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed. For a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone tablet was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran from it end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, oh, cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What's it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, said the great voice behind them in their back. It is more magic. They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for his apparently grown back, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan! Cried the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead, then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and the rich sort of smell that seemed to hang around his hair came all over her. Do I look it? He said. Oh, you're real, you're real. Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still that she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, then she would have read a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who was committed to treachery was killed in a stranger's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. And now, oh, yes, now, said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a moment, his eyes very bright, his limbs gathering and quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a high leap over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over to it and reached to reach him and leaped again. He leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and around the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch him with his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three would roll over again in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as one that is ever seen in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy couldn't quite make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay down, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt the least tired, or hungry, or thirsty. "And now," Aslan said presently, "to business. I feel I'm going to roar. You'd better put fingers in your ears." And they did, and Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face was so terrible that they didn't dare look at it. And they saw the trees in front of them bend before the blast of his roaring, as the grass bends to a meadow before the wind. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed there with her onto the warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave he rose underneath them, and they shot off faster than a horse could go down the hill and into the thick of the forest. The ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that when they take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead almost a noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of a horse, the soft roughness of the golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you could go about twice as fast as a fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided, never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between the trunks of trees, jumping over the brush and briar and the small streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you're riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across the sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of sunny white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes, slight with gorse, bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges of down again into wild valleys and out into the blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to have all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time even to ask themselves what it was, they were already level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning at them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut, and Ashland, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight at them as a bullet toward it. "The witch's house!" he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." Next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for the greater leap than any he had made before, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of the wild stone courtyard, full of statues